It all began with rain. It fell in heavy sheets as I was lined up waiting for a taxi at Santa Maria Novella train station in Florence. The queue was not undercover, and I didn't have an umbrella. By the time I got into the cab, I was soaking wet. I was in a city where I didn't know a soul, unanchored from work, friends and family. A piece of human flotsam washed up in its Renaissance gutters. All I had, clutched in my damp hand, was the address of the flat where I was to stay. As I reached the top of the line, I uncrumpled it, showed it to the cab driver and got in. He grunted and pulled out, frowning at the puddle forming at my feet behind him. We swept through the slick, cobbled streets. The heating was on full blast, and my sodden coat was fogging up the cab. I peered through steamed-up windows at the stone walls of ancient buildings rising up on either side of the road, water dripping off their deep eaves. The streets were deserted. It was the 2nd of January, and the city was still sleeping off its hangover. My own New Year's Eve had been spent stuffing boxes into corners in my parents' flat under the beady eye of my mother, who said nothing but whose every breath asked me what on earth I thought I was doing, giving up a good flat and a job so prestigious it came with embossed business cards, to move my possessions into her already overcrowded apartment and flit off to Florence to play at being a writer. I may as well have announced I was going to Italy to run a brothel. The cab driver slowed down, gestured to the left and grunted. I turned round to take in the majestic proportions of a colonnaded piazza, a cathedral looming up at the end of the square, its white facade reflected in the glistening ground. My mouth fell open. It wasn't just the beauty of the square, but the theatricality of it too, the way the eye was led to the facade of the church. Si chiama Santa Croce, the driver said. Then, indicating the statue of a scowling man, he said, E quello lì è Dante. Dante looked as grumpy and bad-tempered as my cab driver, yet I was cheered. The man credited with inventing the modern Italian language in his Divine Comedy was standing right there, holding a book in his stony hands, looking at me with his basilisk stare. It was a good omen. The basilica stood solidly behind Dante's statue, the entire square constructed to induce awe in the insignificant human approaching it, as well as delight and marvel in the beauty. It was my first brush with the perfection of Italian presentation, the importance of the harmony of form, the genius of the impact on the onlooker, the moral weight given to beauty. It was Bella Figura embodied in stone and marble. We crossed a nondescript bridge. This time, the cabbie pointed to the right, where the Ponte Vecchio squatted over the river on low arches. Lit up against the night, its row of matchbox shops hanging over the water, it shimmered like a dream. I took it in, wide-eyed, as we drove on, swinging into the Oltrarno, the other side of the Riva Arno from the historic centre, winding through cobbled streets to pull up at my new front door. Eccoci, the driver said as he heaved himself from his seat. I paid and stepped out straight into a puddle. I hurried into the entrance hall, taking in its cavernous proportions as I dripped onto the flagstone floor. A flight of wide stone stairs twisted off to the right, and I lugged my bags up, stopping to rest on a narrow bench on what felt like the 108th floor, panting. It was still a long way from the top. The steps dipped in the middle, worn by centuries of feet. The building dated from the 17th century, the silence thick with ghosts. I resumed my climb and finally stood in front of a Tiffany-glued door, its paint cracked and curling. The lock was a massive iron box with a large keyhole. Fortified, ancient. I pulled out an equally antiquated-looking key and opened the door.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.